Good afternoon. This is meteorologist Drew Lerner of World Weather Incorporated, and you are looking at the U.S. percent of normal for the past 3 months. This is coming from the satellite imagery as well as some surface data as well. And clearly you can see on this particular chart, nothing should be new and unusual to you. I just wanted to point out the fact that we have seen some persistent below normal precipitation over a big part of the country. And certainly the most recent data continues to reinforce a lot of this. Now, we are seeing a below normal precipitation bias there in the last 3 months. That would be from November 16th through the 15th of February. Now, more recent data reflects similar conditions. One thing I did want to point out is that there was a considerable amount of moisture that occurred in the central parts of the United States in November, and it did bolster the moisture profile significantly. But since the 1st of December, even the last week in November, it has been drier biased across many of these areas in the plains, as well as the western corn and soybean producing areas. The dryness is most serious in the southwestern part of the United States and also in the southwest plains, and from there into northern Mexico. Drought is very serious down that way. In recent weeks, and we have seen above normal precipitation occur in parts of northern California, Oregon, and parts of central Washington. That has improved the topsoil moisture situation there greatly. We have also, just this past week, seen some substantial rains occur across parts of the northern delta into Kentucky and northwestern Tennessee. Anywhere from 1.5 upwards to 6 inches of rain in general took place at that point. There were local totals of 6 to 8 inches that were noted as well. That pushed them over the top. The moisture profile prior to that had been a little bit on the light side, but there have been frequent occurrences of precipitation in that region. And then lastly, the dryness in the southeastern part of the United States is of interest, especially for corn and cotton producers, as well as a few other crops that are produced from the eastern part of Georgia into North Carolina. All of these areas are unlikely to see a big change in the overall pattern for a while. That dryness that we've looked at not only occurred since the 1st of December, but it also occurred in the summer, if you recall, from the end of July all the way into October. So really, it's been almost 6 months of below normal precipitation for portions of the northern plains and upper Midwest. And that's the reason why the U.S. Drought Monitor looks like it does, with some moderate to severe drought in parts of the northern plains and a portion of the upper Midwest. But the more serious drought continues to be in the southwestern part of the country. Now, the biggest concern that we have is over the pattern that we've been in. It's a stagnant weather pattern. It's not likely to change, certainly not through the first half of March. And so we're going to see a persistence of precipitation that is going to be lacking in the middle of the country. Now, these are the 7-day rain totals that occurred through February 20th. And just wanted to point out that heavy rain event that occurred in Kentucky and Tennessee in the northern parts of the Delta, and additional rain that occurred in California and the West Coast, all the way up to western Washington. But this is a pattern that's going to prevail. As we go forward in time, there's going to be a frequent succession of high pressure systems that are going to work their way from northwest to southeast across the country. There's a deep upper level low, and folks are calling it a polar vortex, and that's what it really is. It's located up in the northern part of the Hudson Bay area, and the air circulation around that low is going to be counterclockwise. And high pressure systems will come in that flow pattern, working their way from northwest to southeast across the central and eastern parts of the U.S. What's different about this pattern versus what we just came through is that the coldest air is going to be in Ontario instead of in Canada's prairies. And the flow pattern is shifted far enough to the east that there will be a cooler bias in the Great Lakes region, parts of the eastern Midwest and the northeastern U.S., but when you get out into the plains, it's not going to be nearly as cold as it has been. And of course, before this pattern sets up, we will see some warmer days, in fact, well above normal temperatures in the middle of the country. The latest soil assessment is a reflection of the past weather certainly shows a big part of the lower eastern Midwest, the Delta, and interior parts of the Southeast with saturated soil. Now, even though we show saturated conditions, we even show some adequate soil moisture in eastern parts of Georgia and South Carolina and southeastern North Carolina, where I showed it had been below normal precipitation. But I'll tell you what, as soon as it warms up in this region, this area will turn dry very quickly because the moisture profile doesn't extend down very deeply, at least as far as the adequate moisture rating. So a few days of 60 and 70-degree highs and presto will be too dry in those areas. But the wet bias in the Delta, especially the northern Delta into parts of Kentucky and the Ohio River Valley, is more of a byproduct of the excessive rain that occurred here recently. On the soil assessment chart, you can clearly see the dry bias that's prevailing across the high plains region, of course, also in the southwestern United States, matching fairly well with that below normal precipitation we've seen the last 3 months. Now, the soil moisture profile is still not too bad in parts of Minnesota and even in Iowa, even though precipitation's been below normal. But just like in the southeast corner of the country, that is a little misleading. As soon as we warm up in this region, those moisture deficits from the past 6 months will quickly surface, and we'll start seeing drier bias indications showing up in the moisture profile. And again, we're just a few weeks away from seasonal warming, so it's very important that we get more moisture to occur in that particular area. And of course, the Pacific Northwest is doing much better. They were too dry during the autumn last year, but the Snake River Valley and the Columbia River Basin area, including the Yakima Valley, have seen much improved conditions. The snow cover today is still fairly significant across the U.S. The depths are fairly light, though, and what's more important, even though we have some significant snow on the ground in parts of Nebraska and Iowa, that snow is not holding a lot of moisture content because it all fell when it was bitterly cold. And so there may be anywhere from 4 to 10 inches of snow on the ground, but when you melt it down, it might be not much more than a couple tenths of an inch of moisture, maybe as much as a half inch, but that's not going to benefit these areas for very long. Farther to the north, we do have some greater snow on the ground, but it's mostly outside of key corn and soybean producing areas. There's also some significant snow on the ground in parts of Montana where there's moisture deficits deep in the ground, but there's a lot of frost in the ground here. So when the snow melts, it's not going to go into the soil, at least the majority of it probably will just run off. Notice that we're dry biased in southern parts of Alberta, by the way, and this dry area in portions of South Dakota, that's snow-free conditions, actually, that is reflective of the fact that we are a little bit concerned about winter wheat damage in this area because it was so cold this past week with no snow. In Illinois, there was also a limited amount of snow on the ground, but we don't believe that there was much damage done just simply because the temperatures were not cold enough there. But we did have snow-free conditions also occurring out here in a big part of West Texas, Western Oklahoma, Southwest Kansas, and Southeastern Colorado. And so not only is it too dry out here, but there is the potential that we might have done some damage to some of the wheat crop. And it's not just what occurred this past week. Most of the hard red winter wheat country was subjected to very cold conditions in mid-January without snow on the ground as well. But I've digressed here. The main point of this discussion is about the dry bias and the fact that there's not going to be a lot of moisture contributed to this particular situation. Now, as we go out and look at the forecast for the next week, you can clearly see that there's not much precipitation being advertised in the plains or the western Midwest. This is a 7-day map. If we go out a little bit farther and take it out 10 days, we get a little bit more moisture showing up in portions of the upper Midwest, but that's because of those snow events that are going to be rotating around that low pressure system north of Hudson Bay. And so as a result, we're still not going to be seeing significant amounts of moisture. Now, I'll tell you right now, the upper air wind flow pattern will not change greatly all the way through the first half of March. And so the dry bias that's in the hard red winter wheat country and the western corn and soybean producing areas, as well as the desert southwest into northern Mexico, is all going to prevail. We may also keep the moisture deficits in place from Virginia into eastern Georgia, although those areas will have an opportunity for some periodic precipitation. This is meteorologist Drew Lerner.